Okay, when you get your lunch, we can start. We have a special China forum today. Today is Friday, and also we have so many things going on today. That's why we don't have a big crowd. In fact, there's another event just next door on the torture. Is that the women in the security? They have another event at the same time. And also downstairs they have a board meeting. So we have a lot of things going on in this building today. That's why we don't get many students, or as many as we want to have. But good, small number is good for our discussion. We have a very special guest today from really far away, from Poland. Dr. Dominik, I can never pronounce his last name. Really, I have to get his help again. Mierzejewsk. Many times, every time I need his help. But I will just give up eventually. So let him to Mierzejewski. Just give up. And I just call him Dominik. I met Dominik many years ago. I don't know how long or how recently we saw each other at conferences many times. And he received his degrees, MA and a PhD, from University of Lodz. Okay. In Poland. I never been in that city, so I don't know how. She said it's the second largest city in Poland. I only know Warsaw, never been in Lodz, but it's a very good university, and he is also one of very few Polish scholars working on China. In Poland, it's not like in the US, there's not a big China watch community. In fact, according to what he told me, there are a few very good China scholars of old generation now in the 1970s, in their 70s, and they were in China in 1960s and 50s, 60s, 70s. But since then has a kind of a gap, disruption of training China scholars. Then it's his generation. He's one of the new generation of Polish scholars working on China, and in fact he spent the whole year last year in China with his family. That's another thing I've discovered. Most of Polish China scholars were trained in China, not as
made in China.
Made in China. It took his son was trained in China, and not like other countries trained in the West. So that would be very interesting, give us a very different perspective. And what he is going to discuss with us today is his observations of China's foreign policy rhetorics and its these foreign policy actions. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Dominik. That's what I can.
Thank you for having me here. Just a few seconds. A little. Enlightenment's coming from up. So. Let me just say a few words. I'm not a native speaker, so definitely on some slides you find some mistakes, and please forgive. But definitely, my today's talk is dedicated to my ongoing research project on rhetoric and diplomacy and China case study. Of course, I will discuss kind of in a few words the research approach, definitions, rhetoric and soft power. And to my understanding, China's foreign policy rhetoric should be divided into three parts, or three levels. General one, peace and development, independent policy of peace, peaceful rise, harmonious world. The second, detailed rhetoric. So I try to compare over the last 30 years how the rhetoric has been changing in the case of the China-US relationship. What kind of language the Chinese leadership used while being here in the United States. And the last point is the crisis rhetoric. What kind of language Chinese used while angry, while being angry, with Vietnamese, with NATO, with Tiananmen and human rights, North Korea, and also Kosovo, as you see here, the Thailand crisis, North Korea, and finally, I try to sum up my understanding of the subject of rhetoric and diplomacy. I put emphasis on constructivist approach. So I'm mainly focusing on language, values, identity, and soft power. Of course, I will look through the language Chinese diplomacy used through last 30 years. And finally, it's pretty difficult via language and rhetoric, argumentation, to decode China's international behavior. So I hope you find this approach quite, let's say, attractive. Of course, here we have a variety of notions, like values. To my view, Chinese try to transmit a very utopian worldview, like Tianxia, or 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. So that's definitely, to my understanding, Chinese utopia. Identity, the second notion, is shaped by interaction with other, needs for self-perception contrary to other powers. So that's why Chinese will say a lot of ancient China, a lot of traditional values, because they try to be different from the West, mainly. Language. Language should be understood as a tool of transmission of identity, vehicle of ideology, interest, and image. And finally, influence, ability to shape preferences. And of course, when we look through the Chinese language, it's pretty difficult to find precise notions of the rhetoric. You see here language, 字, like made of speech, 见, 说, 说, 明, 辩, 修辞, and 真名, very traditional way of approaching names, rectification of names. So from this point of view, we from the Western kind of different culture, we face a big problem. What is the real meaning of the words? Context and also meaning only in the case of rhetoric. Watson said that public addresses and discussions of rhetoric in China before the 1st century before Christ are almost totally concerned with efforts to restore order to society, to induce rulers to act wisely, justly, and compassionately toward people, to encourage the public to respond with loyalty to the regime, and kind of perpetuate ancient tradition in ritual and social relationship. It's a very short, because we don't have time to have a deep understanding of the ancient discourse of the rhetoric. So for Confucius, names are not passive labels, but rather a social and political catalyst. So the language matters from this point of view, I think. And the power of symbols in the human motivation is very important. For Lao Tzu, another very famous philosopher, I'm not sure whether he was real or not, but he relied on ethos, essentially humility, goodness, respectfulness, in the sense of language. 韩非子 legalist. That's pretty much about the speaker must know the soul of the listener. You must know the audience and adapt the message to the understanding of the audience. Here, I think the subject is pretty important in terms of whether Chinese diplomatic rhetoric is successful. Because the power of persuasive discourse is to constitute audience out of individuals, to transform singularities into collectiveness, to fashion a we out of plurality of eyes, and to move them to collective action. And my question here is whether the whole discourse, the whole rhetoric of Chinese diplomacy over the last 30 years is successful in terms of building a coalition. Because China talking a lot about we are a developing country. We hope to be together with the developing countries. But the question is whether this is a successful soft power, whether China can persuade others to be together with China, or China will be in a future power, one power without friends, let's say. There are a lot of discussion inside Beijing today whether China will have a friends in an international relationship, or be one polar, only one pole. We see United States, and I'm from Poland, we support George W. Bush, and we went to Iraq, and so on and so forth. We are a Trojan horse of the American Europe. But whether in the future China have a Trojan horse in Europe, that's a question, big question mark. So, soft power is about persuasion, the ability to move people by argument, the ability to attract and shape preferences. And also, we can also, I think we should, just look through the Mao Zedong thoughts. Because in the case of language, he's a very important figure. Because in terms of propaganda, in terms of knowing the audience, you can read from the slide that he followed legalist school. You guys, the member of the Communist Party, you have to know masses. And you have to use the language of the masses to be together with them. So he followed Han Feizi thoughts, as you can read from the slide. Of course, Joseph Nye presented a brilliant concept of soft power, but here rhetoric is a vehicle for a set of ideological values. And let me go to the details. At the general level, peace and development, China is developing socialist country, peaceful rise, harmonious China, Asia, and the world. So 4 sets of, let's say, general view on rhetoric. Of course, at the beginning, in 1978, when China started its reforms and opening up, Deng Xiaoping faced the big challenges, the challenges of the past. So the rhetoric, in this period of time, I think in the early 80s, played a crucial role in terms of fighting against Hua Guofeng, another political figure at this time. So he used, contrary to Mao's Cultural Revolution rhetoric, a very peaceful rhetoric. And his declaration told Taiwan in January 1979, I think at least it was not so important for Taiwanese, but for the internal audience. He showed that we can develop this country in a different way, in a rather peaceful, not revolutionary way. So he used peace and development in the early 80s. But to my mind, everything was linked to his opponents inside the Communist government. At this time, I think, of course, the relationship with the United States, with Japan, with other countries was an important in terms of China's policy towards Soviet Union. But mainly rhetoric and the whole propaganda machine was concentrated on the leadership battle for power. And of course, peace and development, as you see here, Deng Xiaoping judged that peace is the most crucial issue between East and the West, between Soviet bloc and the United States, development between poor South and rich North. And right now, while talking about harmonious world, Hu Jintao stick to the second point, development. Peace is not the problem of the East and West, but right now it's more complicated. But development is between South and North. My research is about slogans. As I remember Professor John comments after my speech in Nottingham, 2007, I guess. Is it the peaceful rise? You have to look and research the problem of slogans. What kind of slogans the communist government or the diplomatic government or Chinese government uses. So definitely this research is coming out from party reports. You see here that still hegemony is a problem for China. Capitalism, not exactly, right now, 2007. And imperialism, not at all, but hegemony. And some of my friends in Beijing told me that harmony's world is exactly against hegemony. We try to build, but it's only rhetoric. The real policy is different. I'm talking about the constructivist approach, about rhetoric. Marxism, as you see here, still everywhere in China. Everywhere. In any corner you can see some kind of Marxism and so on and so forth. But what might be important here, the slogan, defend the world peace. So China, with its growing assertiveness, try to be a power that will contribute to the human beings, as the Chinese rhetoric said, and try to defend the world peace. How? That's a different story. Of course, China is also against power politics, and China is supporting developing countries. China hoped to build harmony's world. That's about 2007. But mainly Chinese focusing on the internal affairs. Some friends of mine in Beijing said, well, Chinese government, 90% domestic affairs, 10% foreign policy. For them, domestic issues, China is so complex. You have Uyghurs, you have Tibetans, all these guys from minorities, and so on and so forth, and also social issues. So definitely 80-90% the Chinese government is focusing on the internal affairs. But here, advocates verb. From 2002, China advocates. So that means that from being passive, like during Deng's time and during 1990s, China hoped to contribute to the human being. And China advocate for fair, equal, and so on and so forth, global economy order. They are talking only about economy, not about political issues. That's also an important to follow it for Chinese. And to my mind, that's my kind of understanding after being 1 year. In a sense, the Chinese government believe in material issues only. In this sense, they are real communists, because they believe only in the things that is material. Non-material issues like faith, beliefs, not at all. We believe just seeking the fact from the truth, seeking the truth from the fact. So in this sense, I came from the post-socialist country. So to my mind, believing only in the material issue, that means that you guys are communists, are real communists. But Zhu Zhang, China advocate. Let me be back to my lecture. More active, not passive behavior. So 2002, and this year the Chinese government announced Go Global strategy. So this rhetoric fits the reality. We advocate for something and we go global with our pocket. We're gonna invest everywhere, probably, not in the United States. Peaceful rise. And also here, because of the whole propaganda machine, the language is very important for the government. So that's why maybe it's not so important for the outside audience, but for the domestic audience. And if you look into peaceful rise, whatever we can call it, concept, slogan, rhetoric, I think that is mainly based in 1990s internal debates on Chineseness. At the end of the day, Chinese government tried to fulfill the expectation of Chinese people, intellectuals, like New Left, as you see here, the internal discourse, Wang Hui, Cui Ziyuan, and others, pro-China. China can rise, but for us, it was not so important. Still, I think that any kind of debates are important for Chinese people. If you look at the Olympics, the opening ceremony, whether Chinese care about us, no, I don't think so. They care about themselves. Well, we Chinese can do. We don't care about the outside world. Really, that's my impression. And I was talking to some scholars, and they said, yes, that was for us. That was for our nation. That yes, we can. Like Obama a few years ago. So definitely, and also about patriotic education. That we are rising with our heritage, with our greatness, and so on, and so splendid culture, and here enhanced cohesion. This is an important issue while talking about the rhetoric. That China is so complex. The people from Guangdong, from Dongbei, from northeast of China are totally different. And China is on its way to be a nation state, I think. It's not done yet, I think. So the whole rhetoric is very important. And the peaceful rise concept, slogan, in terms of unifying people, was a very important one. Yes, we can. We can rise peacefully. We're gonna rise for peace. We are a very peace-loving nation, like other nations around the world. But we Chinese. So mainly they are on their own road to the big Chinese nation. And you see here, Zheng Bijian, Peaceful Rise, 2003. And I think for the second time, I guess, when Jiabao, here in the United States, he tried to explain why China can rise peacefully, or could rise peacefully, by using a very, let's say, cultural-oriented arguments. We are the oldest civilization. We have a great interaction. The Chinese people's path of independent building socialism and with Chinese characteristics. That's another story. Socialism is a very peaceful system. We also enjoy in Poland the same kind of rhetoric in 50s, 60s, 70s. And he said everybody is responsible for the rise and fall of the country. And here we have a problem with Tianxia. What exactly does it mean? Tianxia. Is it a state, as it was translated into English, or the whole world? So this is a really tricky game sometimes, because the diplomats try to have the proper understanding, and scholars also, of what's up, what's the real problem. And also he used a very famous Confucius set of values: don't do to others what you don't want others to do to you. So definitely he started to use a very cultural-oriented rhetoric. We China, since ages, especially during Qing and Yuan dynasty. Of course, they were Manchurian, not Chinese. The real Chinese are very peaceful. So this argumentation might be, but the crowd might be interesting, but who's gonna buy it? That's the problem. When we skip to the harmonious world, we have the same problem with peaceful rise, peace and development, internal audience, and the whole propaganda machine. So you see here, what is the difference between the world and us? There is no difference. There are no differences. You see here equality. We need equality in China. The world needs also equality. Equal, not discrimination, world trade system. Democracy, rule of law. Democratization of international relationship. Honesty and friendship. Exchange, growing together. Stability and order. Common education, equal rights for women. Public health ability. Harmony with the nature. A clean, natural environment. So, if you can imagine how the whole propaganda operates in China, the answer is very clear. Harmony's war is not because of the war, it's because of China. So my understanding of here at this general level is that it has nothing to do with building a soft power. Of course, soft power, but towards all nations. They used all these arguments. You see, just imagine, when you rebel and a lot of Kaipai meetings daily, they are talking the same stuff. Harmonious world, harmonious society. Well, yes, we need the harmonious China. We need the harmonious world. So this kind of, I think, this kind of political system is very important here. And you see here people's harmony. This contributes to Plekhanov's theory of history, that people are the master of the history. So definitely, if we look also in this chart, we see that in three statements on harmony, this is a declaration signed together with Russia in August 2005. People's relationship, most important. Developing countries, most important. Developed countries, somewhere. So definitely, as you see here also, in the sense that China is still in the sphere of propaganda and rhetoric, very communist country, and Plekhanov is still there. We see people's relationship as a very important one. And the moral rhetoric, the harmonious world and society, I think, should be linked to kind of morality, but for our own people. The government in China acknowledged the big issues, the big problem inside the country. So that's why they used the new slogan of harmonious world, of harmonious society, and next, harmonious world. As you see here, the importance of morality, and you look into Zhenin Ribao daily, they are talking about Lei Feng, a very famous hero from 60s, about Yi De Zi Guo, what they call govern country by moral stuff, and build spiritual culture. It's also kind of defending China from the Western way of thoughts. Still there, discussion in Confucius, like Guoxue, national studies versus Western studies. But it's the history of this is a history, I think. And also building the ideological platform from society and for China's identity in IR, but at the first point, the cohesion inside. Because really the society is so diverse, and it's really difficult, I think, for Chinese government to run this country without having this rhetoric in foreign policy, in general level. So this, to my mind, is a very, very crucial, but only in terms of governing China, governing this country, and putting this country has nothing to do with foreign policy. Or maybe this comment is too strong, but I think that the primary is about domestic affairs. As you see here also, solve dialogue, evil of capitalism, and same political goals are different from the goal of capitalist countries in this discourse. You can also sing brilliant songs about harmony. You can watch Zhou Xiang, we are going towards harmony. The second level. that might be also a very important one. Detailed, I call detailed. I'm not sure whether this kind of notion exists in English language, but still, I will compare the visit of Deng Xiaoping, Zhao Ziyang, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and the last visit, and the statement made by this leadership in America. Of course, this is a very famous picture. Professor Zhao talked about this Monday.
这是季朝柱。
季朝柱
Yeah.
Translator. Here, important issue is that there was a new chapter in bilateral relationship, and Deng Xiaoping was here during Chongjian, so he used this in his statement here that visit during the Chinese New Year is really matter for us. This kind of new step, reunification of families. So in terms of rhetoric, it was a good argument, and also a good time to rebuild the relationship with America. The big success of Chinese diplomacy this time was the statement that both sides were against hegemony. And interesting here is when you compare the treaty with Japan and treaty with United States and the communique after this visit. It was really that in the Japanese treaty with Japanese, the Chinese said that other states' hegemony that meant that it was against Soviet Union. In this, there was nothing like this. American people, great people, of course, and pragmatic people. So he used this 九世情圣, the spirit of pragmatism. He described himself as a very pragmatic, seeking the truth from the fact. For us, it's a little bit tricky. How you can seek the truth from the fact? It's very obvious one, I think. But for him, it was something against Mao Zedong this time. And he said that we need to study American model. We need China as a backward country, and we need to study. And we see the evolution from a student to the teacher. While the last visit of Xi Jinping, he was not exactly like a teacher, but his rhetoric was, to some extent, like Zhao Ziyang. The second visit with Reagan here, he used the term Chinese government, because Deng Xiaoping, he didn't use Chinese government, because all the time they used Chinese American people. Attached importance to bilateral relationship, lasting development. He said he used, I look for Renmin Ribao from 80s, and Zhao Ziyang used the frame 现在还不好说. It's better not to talk. And he didn't mention Taiwan. He said, you have some problems, but 还不好说. Based on 5 principles, that's for sure. Both states and people are great. Chinese and the world people's interests are the same. This is a very important. That the Chinese rhetoric and the detailed level, they said that, well, we are the same. We are like other people. So it's also kind of trauma of the past, of self-isolation. The Chinese needed to strengthen this voice. We are together with you. And I've been war last year, 2011. He said, well, we will be with the war. What's up? Why the hell you said this? I was really confused, and all diplomats, is there any new thing? No. Still, this the trauma of the past. We don't want to be kind of self-isolated country. We hope to be together with the whole community. All the time the same. Of course, China will defend peace, stability as unchangeable policy, he said during his visit. And also during his visit, he used the 国际主义. China will defend internationalism. something 国际主义，好说。1997. Here, important issue is that Jiang Zemin used the term strategic partnership. First and last time the Chinese leadership here in the United States, as I noticed, used the term that we have a strategic relationship with the United States. As far as I know, some friends of mine in Beijing told me that during Hu Jintao's visit last year, January, the Chinese side tried to persuade Americans to use the term strategic relationship. The Americans said no. So that's also a very, very important issue. That was the first visit after Zhao Ziyang, Tiananmen Square, and so on and so forth. And also he used the seek common ground while holding back differences. But this time he said Taiwan is the major obstacle. In a very open manner, not like 还不好说. 2002, I think that I've noticed that it's the first time that Chinese leaders use the Chinese culture to describe and to persuade the other side that we are very peaceful. We are looking for unity in diversity, but only between noble people. That's also a very tricky game. Who is noble people? 小人. It's if you quote Confucius, 君子和而不同，小人同而不和. So this is really, what is really here, and he used 君子because usually Chinese diplomats use only 和而不同 without 君子, without double. So for me, I'm really confused. Who is 君子? Who is a noble man? Americans? I don't know. And he also is being honest as a basis, peace as a treasure, trust as the first. But he also, for the first time, he assumed that there is an asymmetry in bilateral relationship. Developing state versus developed country. And since Deng Xiaoping, they used the kind of conditionality. The world peace is conditional upon Sino-American stable relationship. If not, the whole world will face a big challenge. So you Americans might notice it, that everything is up to our relationship. Hu Jintao, and his statement was really, without any kind of proverbs, without any kind of videos. And I was really disappointed with this statement because it was so simple. He said partnership, cooperation, but not strategic. That's very important. He didn't say not strategic, of course, but compared to Jiang Zemin, 1997, he was not allowed to say that we hope to build a strategic relationship with America. Asymmetry, same as Jiang Zemin. Not zero-sum game. I win, you lose, swung in, both sides gonna win. We have to grasp opportunity for cooperation, strengthen and build new channels for consultation. And the last one, I think here we have a new, how to call it, new quality. Because of this, because of the language, because of the what kind of language Xi Jinping used here in America. He used proverb, while drinking water, remember people who sing the well. Kissinger, Nixon, Chairman Mao, Zhou Enlai, and others. This phrase was used by Hu Yaobang during his visit to Japan. And this is really important. We remember the past, and we hope to build a relationship with you. Another one is, it's very also, because Chinese language is so complex and it's so difficult, not to learn, but to interpret. This statement quotes from Song Dynasty famous general Xin Qiji. I'm not. I think my pronunciation was also not so. Okay. Again, it was a statement. It was a piece against mistake made by Sofer and Sung dynasty due to their lack of motherland unification. But also, it was used by Wei Jiabao in Copenhagen during his visit to Japan. That means that we together need to build a future and to unify our own forces to have a brilliant future, to unify the world. I think that's my understanding, of course. But you can read also this in the case of Taiwan, that there's some obstacles in unification with Taiwan. So it's very difficult to have a proper understanding. The next is the bilateral relationship. Of course, it's very difficult to have a proper translation into English language. 路在脚下. And you have to be pragmatic. That's my understanding, because a bilateral relationship are very sensitive. Caution should be exercised. A pragmatic approach should be taken. And the last point about human rights. He said that, as you see here, 在人权问题上没有最好，只有更好. This is a teacher right now. Not like Deng Xiaoping, we're going to study low profile. We need to study a model. But right now, Xi Jinping discovered, in terms of human rights, there are not the best human rights, but only better. That means that we don't want to follow your model. We have our own model. Official translation. Of course, there is always room for improvement when it comes to the human rights. Totally different meaning. Totally different meaning. So here, I think we can see that Chinese, in the sense of using language while being here in the United States, they they develop their understanding of assertiveness and self-confidence. Because Deng Xiaoping, low profile, we need to study. And right now, Xi Jinping said, come on. 最好没有最好. They're not the best all around the world here in the United States of human rights, but only better. And the difference between best and better might be, a very, small one. Crisis level. Here we have a very famous saying, 大官养会, and also it's very tricky for us. And tricky for us because of the real understanding, the real meaning. High intention, bide your time, low profile, 却不挡斗, not be a leader of social scam. And that was during the Tiananmen crisis. So it was pretty pragmatic policy. Right now we have nothing to do but hide our intention, bide our time, and wait for our chance. The next one is haran, an adjective that express anger and dissatisfaction. And it's, during a very, let's say, critical situation, Chinese diplomacy used haran. After North Korea test, statement by foreign minister speaker. Koizumi visit by a minister. Senkaku Diaoitai conflict. Foreign minister. NATO. Chinese embassy. NATO bombed Chinese embassy in Belgrade in May 1999. The government, in the statement made by the government, they use hara. We are really angry with your action. And veto in 1997. But here, of course, the context is very important. for the interior audience, Jiang Zemin used a very tough proverb. 我姓惨淡. In 1999, in his speech, internal speech on international situation, he used this: we need to hide our intentions, capacity, and wait for the revenge. So that's why here the rhetoric also, and maybe in this crisis situations, are really important for the public opinion. So at the detail level, it's an important for the partner. But at the crisis level, 我心常淡, I'm a strong government. Because this time, probably you remember, Jiang Zemin was accused of being same as Qing dynasty government. You are not a real Chinese government. So he used 我心常淡. There's also one of the interpretation of Dogma Yang. But we need to hide our intention, capacity, and wait for the revenge. So in this context, it was really, let's say, harsh language. Another one, 悬崖勒马, is also a very, very nice in the sense that you have to stop your horse before the cliff. The war is inevitable. That's how Chinese, the Chinese side in 1950 entered the Korean War by saying, Americans, 悬崖勒马, you need to stop your horse before the cliff, otherwise we're gonna see you in Korea. During the Taiwan crisis they used, but of course it was a big crisis in mid 1990s. To some scholars said that it was against Taoban Yanghui, and definitely it was the end of the Taoban Yanghui, Taiwan crisis in mid 1990s. And after Li Denghui, so also 悬崖勒马during Mao's time has a slightly different meaning than right now. Stop your horse before the cliff. 不可忍 also, but of course, when the Chinese government issued a statement, the government is saying that our people cannot tolerate this kind of behavior. So, 不可忍, before the conflict with India and Vietnam in 1979 and 1962. And here also we have the Plekhanov concept of the history. The people are the master of the history. I hope we have a discussion after. Definitely, my understanding of the first level, general level of rhetoric, is kind of, building the positive image, replying to China threat. It's more sophisticated right now than in 1980s and 1990s because this rhetoric is based on Chinese culture. The Chinese leadership used a lot of proverbs, idioms that strengthen, of course, China's our identity. We are different. We have our own culture. We can use our own language. Very complex one, very difficult one for you, for us also. Because to some extent Chinese scholars in Beijing they are also in trouble because the government used this kind of vocabulary, and as I know at Beida University they have special classes how to read People's Daily. If you look, for example, through the People's Daily newspaper, there are really important, I think, the nicknames. The author is like Zhongsheng, the bell voice.
People's voice.
People's
voice.
Yeah.
中餐.
So they have special classes, PhD, assistant professors. How to read, because Chinese propaganda is not very easy to read. So the most important issue is, I think, as same in Poland, Hungary, and this part of the world, was reading between lines. So this is the most interesting job, I think, right now. For example, I came into conclusion that after reading a lot of stuff on public diplomacy, I discovered that it has nothing to do with diplomacy, but with the internal affairs, with transparency, democracy in China. So academics use this kind of debates as a leverage. Say, we are disappointed with this government. But just reading between lines, because there is a thin line, let's say. If you cross this line, you will enjoy the same stuff as Liu Xiaobo. Of course, to some extent, the moral language, but there are a lot of skeptics in Beijing that China will have kind of Chinese Wilsonism, Jeffersonism, but there is a need for this kind of concept. And also via rhetoric, we see that growing self-confidence from Muslim to partner state, but still, to my mind, as you saw in the chart, harmonious society, harmonious world, the most crucial issue here is the internal public opinion. Because truly running this big country without democracy is pretty tough stuff. It's a really difficult situation without the big ideology or big religion. Almost impossible. You need to have a propaganda machine like in China to have this kind of big, complex, diverse country together as one China. Still, they have some obstacles, as Zhao Ziyang said. 现在还不好说. But definitely, the second level, attract partner, but mislead. This is really what Chinese language can offer. Because the interpretation of the statement is so difficult. As Sun Tzu said, you have to win war without a war. So make them, let's say, confused. And the last one, crisis level. Majority for internal opinion, I think, especially after Kosovo crisis and May 1999, they used 我心惨淡 just to show that we are a very tough government. Public opinion, expectations, and kind of nationalistic feelings. And during the crisis, for sure they will use very harsh language, but only to fulfill this kind of nationalistic feelings. And, well, this is the end of the story of rhetoric. I hope you enjoy my, let's say, 40 minutes or 15 minutes talk. And hope you have some comments and questions.
And thank you for such a one. Has been here almost a week. So for the most recent Xi Jinping visit, he did research here. And he sit in the downstairs cyber cafe and read Chinese newspapers about stories of Xi Jinping's visit. Then picked up all those Chinese friends and put here. I think it's really interesting presentation. Okay, the floor is open and okay, to start from.
I'm a little bit confused about what do you mean by more rhetoric, because if I really follow the whole presentation, it seems to me at the end of the conclusion is that by more rhetoric, you actually means those proverbs, saying, or phrases quoted from the, ancient Chinese books or those sources, instead of like morality, the kind of morality I thought. So I'm a little bit confused here because could you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, I will clarify this. That's for sure. It was not it was not a clear-cut picture in my presentation. By morality rhetoric, I mean that due to internal demands, Chinese authority needs to talk about moral issues like harmony. How to build harmony? Because we have a very messy situation inside. So we need to have a kind of shift from, let's say, more pragmatic, make money, 发财发财, rhetoric, to the moral one. Because we are facing a lot of moral problems in China. People cannot trust each other. So my experience is a very small one. But I spent together 3 years in mainland China. In Shanghai, Beijing, and traveling around the country. So definitely these kind of problems are really crucial for the future of China. So that's why the government, as the government itself described as the utilitarian one. So they have a lot of meetings from the unit level up to the central level. So they know what's going on at the grassroots level. So they just respond to all of these problems, let's say, in the grassroots level. So that's why they use harmony, and they use this whole Confucius, Lao Tzu, hundreds and not exactly. They use this moral rhetoric because on the one hand, there is a great need to run this country, and the second one, to answer the whole debates in 1990s, 过去是, this national studies fever. So definitely that was the real issue of moral rhetoric. That's why they shift from very pragmatic one to moral.
Yeah, but the issue, whether it is because they face the social problem internally, like you say, money becomes a problem right now, and the society, people start to become indifferent to each other. So we need to build a kind of more harmonious society. We have to care. I don't know. I let's just follow what you just said. Whether it's because there is a real social problem, so they shifted to the moral rhetoric, or because like the conclusion is like they have more confidence, so they kind of I'm a little,
Yeah, but my conclusion did not fit my lecture. But definitely, as you are right, the Chinese. I'm not sure whether I have a proper understanding of Chinese people. Chinese people are really kind of low-profile people. Yes, we can just go through some obstacles, zigzagging, like the relationship with America. They are dodging the problem of conflict, like zigzagging everything. 不好说, okay, we have time, no problem. But mainly they use within the propaganda mechanism, machine, because of their internal problem.
More questions? Okay, from here.
I have first two things, because I don't know if I understood correct what you say. When you quote the phrase
from Cuba.
when you quote the proverb, stop the horse before the cliff, it was that they were referring to the Chinese attitude toward the problem, or they were telling the Americans, stop your horse, and not stop the horse, stop your horse before the cliff. I was not sure what do you mean. It's just for information. And the other, you mentioned the Sun Tzu phrase of make. I read it as make your enemy confused, but you quoted here as make your partner confused. So is this the way they say it, or the way you see it? And then there is this is just to say what do you mean? But there is a question. When you said that they say that for domestic audience, I had a more or less the same feeling that she has. Do you mean for the distracting domestic problems, or to frame Chinese internal debate about Chinese foreign policy? They don't want to copy the terms from the West. They simply want to have the debate in their own terms.
Well, regarding Sun Tzu, I did it my way.
Oh, you did, Josef.
Yeah. So definitely, that was a, stop the horse before the cliff. That was, you Americans need to stop, because otherwise you'll have trouble. It depends. The second question, whether they try to frame the internal debate. That's true. In IR scholars in this community, one scholar in Beijing said, we are waiting for an up-down message. If the government will say something, we will substantiate the whole meaning. If there is peaceful rights, right. If there is harmonious world, right. But they are waiting for a signal in this IR community. But the different story is that it's not exactly about the IR community, I think. The real story is about the real problem inside China and how to govern this country without changing the political system.
The analogy that you use about, you call it something like Chinese Wilsonianism, and the morality in Wilson's speech was mainly about the debate within the United States about engagement with the world. It was part of the American debate of American foreign policy. It was not about distracting American issues at the time. But it's interesting.
But political system in these two states, a little bit different. Even America in early 20th century, and right now in China, I think, to some extent that's true that they try to stimulate and they try to see the reaction of the scholars and about nationalism. That's the same story. I interviewed in December a few scholars from Shanghai, from Chinese Academy of Social Science, and they said they tried to check our reaction. So they started to debate on nationalism. That's of course the part of the story, part of the whole system. It's a very complex system. How to govern the country without democracy. And what some call China model.
Lily, you please identify yourself. The first one was, architect student from Taiwan. He is from Cuba. Now, Professor Lily Peter, he is teaching here.
Actually, it's not a question. I just want to give some of my observation and tie to the question of and yours together. And I think there's a fundamental question, which probably is because of the restriction of the time and you cannot address, is to put the change of the rhetorics into the historical frame of Chinese society from a revolutionary society, no matter, since 1911, a Republican Revolution and the revolution, national revolution, and socialist revolution, and cultural revolution, and to a stage which we call it post-revolution or post-Mao society. So this whole, I think, is very interesting topic, and all tied with this historical, very significant change of the Chinese society, which is from the revolutionary rhetoric to the post-revolutionary rhetoric. We all know that the revolutionary rhetoric and generations of the Chinese revolutionaries, they try to sit apart from their own, ideological issues from the history, from the tradition. That's where this, after the Mao period, and then, of course, he is the first generation of the revolutionary, but Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping actually gradually move them away from that tradition. So they want to restore or re-articulate a new rhetoric to explain what they have been doing and to explain the change after the Cultural Revolution. So that's why they tied this kind of the moral, you said moral, actually we can basically equal to, in your discourse, to the traditional discourse, Confucius discourse, Taoist discourse, and all sorts of the traditional discourse use a lot of the the poetry to explain some of the words to avoid the Maoist discourse. So I think that we have to recognize that. In the meantime, I do agree. And for instance, the biggest change is from the rhetoric of class struggle, which has been used for many, many years in China, to the harmonious society. So in this regard, the harmonious society is a progress from the Chinese past to China's future. Because harmonious society, move away from a class-focused, class-oriented focus. So it's okay to be a middle class. It's okay to own some property, and you don't have to worry about the proletariat someday will take over your property in some way. So I think this formulate of the new discourse, you are absolutely right, is mainly focused on the domestic issues. But it does have some positive meaning. Why this have to be put this way rather than just a rhetoric, a propaganda? Because it supports the social change which happened in this past 30 years. So that's just a very, that's my observation.
Response or just let it go?
Well, that's very thank you for your comment. I think that here also the problem of legitimacy, as you mentioned, from class struggle into pro-nation, the whole nation. We don't care about workers, peasants only. 三个代表, for example, the free representation or represent theory. We are the party of the whole nation. That's why we don't want to talk in the sense that the classes are important, Marx's way of dealing with social problems is important, and so on and so forth. So we have a kind of shift. That's my answer.
Okay, any more? Any?
Well, thank you for...
She's a leading scholar from China.
Well, thank you for giving such a wonderful speech. And I have to admit that I didn't pay too much attention on our leaders' speech words.
Friend of mine also.
What interesting thing is that you said you can't find a Chinese translation of rhetoric, yes. But I found that in our English-Chinese dictionary, we do have a Chinese meaning for that word. It means 修辞. Yeah, that's it. And another thing is...
The 修辞 is not quite the English
not-
meaning of...
it's-
Yes,
no.
Yeah, I know that. That's the tricky thing. And another is a small thing that you, in your part, there is a Tiananmen and the Kosovo part. You said...
Crisis.
Yeah, process. There is Minister Li Zhaoxing used Hanren after you said 钓鱼台 conflict, but actually it's not 钓鱼台, it's 钓鱼岛.
Sorry. All right.
Rhetoric.
Yeah, that's really
The place in Beijing, all right. That's,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you for...
Okay, here.
Hi, I'm a master's student studying development here, and I lived in China from 2006 to 2009. I was wondering, do you think that the political rhetoric faces any competition from the social media and what young people are listening to and responding to slogans online like grass, mud, horse, or things that have really captured the imagination of young people more than the government slogans?
Well, this is a basic question, whether this media are free. I'm struggling with myself, and I will say no, they are not. It's a big propaganda machine to stimulate debates, not the response to the debate online, I think. Of course, sometimes, but just compare yesterday issue of Global Times. They published, a few days ago, Global Times, English version. They said that Leifeng is over. Today, we have to follow Leifeng's spirit. So, to some extent, it's pretty difficult to judge whether kind of nationalistic sentiments online really have an impact on the rhetoric. I would say no. No, because the government is very cautious. Because at the beginning of the reform, in the early 80s, Deng Xiaoping said, we don't want to play a kind of language game. So that's why they use peace and development, still the same slogans, because they are really afraid. And my understanding of the whole China, United States foreign policy is the zigzagging. We don't want to have a conflict with a big power, with the hegemon. So definitely, to some extent, it might have, but only during the crisis situation. We have a crisis run. The government is really tough, is really strong. We can compete with America, Europe, Brazil, South Africa, whatever we want. But only during this situation. In a normal life, let's say, I don't see this kind of impact. So still, after being a 1 year visiting scholar in Beijing, based in Institute of World Economics and Politics, I asked some professor, I tried to read your paper. He said, only, how to call it in Chinese, only private talk. You can imagine, this is a reality in China. So all this Weibo and all this online stuff, I'm really not surprised that America will follow the model of China. Right now I saw some problem with Google's and so on and so forth. So because there is a total anarchy in the web sphere, let's say. So that's my answer. I don't see this kind of impact, bottom-up impact.
Okay, last question from Chinese scholar.
Okay. So, GW, Dominik. Okay, and I have two things I want to talk about. This about Chinese history. Most of the people here today, Americans, I should say, we have different backgrounds. So the first one is you mentioned Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu. I assure you, we have this person. Because I come from the hometown of Lao Tzu. Yeah. Lao Tzu, the hometown of Lao Tzu.
Not fake.
Yeah. It's in Henan province, in Ruyi County. So Lao Tzu, the name, the Li are big ears. So Li are. But later, our national religion, the Taoism, choose him as the founder. Okay, that's a religion. Religion, we don't talk about this. So that's Lao Tzu, the true man. The true, that's the story true, okay? Another thing is you talk about, my field is history. So, we have a long history. So you mentioned the Yuan dynasty, right? I should say so, because the different culture. So Yuan also belongs to China. The Mongolians, mentioning Mongolians, in America, you don't have minorities. All the people you shoot ID card, Americans, okay. That's an example.
Or are we equal? Some are minorities.
In China, we have 56 minorities. So that's different. 56, okay. Okay, and we mentioned minorities and Mongolians. We just say at that time, we mean the 天下. Many professors mention the 天下 because they don't know the Chinese history. The Gu Yanwu said, 天下兴亡皮肤有责. 天下 means in dynasty. I mean in that dynasty. So 天下 means the China, the whole China. I mean the territory. Not even the Mongolia belongs to China. Okay, that's one China. That's the meaning 天下 means. So that's the cultural background. Okay, the two things. Okay, thank you.
If you read a very famous philosopher from Chinese Academy of Social Science, Zhao Tingyang,
He's writing on 天下.
he wrote a few pieces on 天下as a word system.
In fact, in my class, Chinese foreign policy class, we are reading about 天下. So quite students in the class, so they know this very well.
Well, and he said something different, but that's also a problem with the communist government rhetoric. 中华民族 and great revival. What is the real 中华? they don't use 中国人 like Chinese, but 中华民族 it's something bigger. 中华.
In English is one word, but in Chinese are different.
Right.
You know, so from your perspective, Mongols, Tibetans, Uyghurs are all Chinese nation because of 中华民族. From my perspective, they are different.
Okay, I think, okay, last one from
Thank you so
student, MA student from China.
Yeah, I'm from China. I'm a student in Professor Zhao's class. I have a question. According to your understanding, is that possible China will change its domestic words or change its domestic ways to communicate with Western countries? Because according to my understandings, China used those colorful words is kind of trying to convince its citizens as well as foreign governments and also the foreign citizens, but kind of it kind of sucks. It doesn't work because according to my understanding, China is a high contest country, and for the United States or European unions and the greatest great powers in the world is kind of a low contest countries. So there's a long gap or a long distance between their communications. So is that possible China will try to use another way to switch its way to close to Western countries and use their ways and the values for communication rather than current situations?
I don't think so, because that's a problem of identity.
Yeah, right.
And so if China will try to do it, as you said, will lose its identity. So for Chinese government, 中国人民, Chinese people, I think there's no way to change, because we need to be as we are. So definitely not like the Western people, or as Deng Xiaoping says, we don't want to change our language, let's say, policy, because they stick to the peace and development rhetoric, and that's done. On the other hand, they will need a real leader. China needs a real leader to change something. Because right now we have, and all around the world I think, there are no people like Churchill, like De Gaulle, like Mao Zedong, like Stalin even. No people with great charisma, because times are different. So definitely that's a matter of the leadership in China, because all of the leadership, 6th generation, 5th generation, they will follow the model. Reform and opening up. We will be with the world, I think.
Okay, with that note, let's end today's discussion. I think it's very interesting. To try to understand Chinese language from the Western perspective is a really big challenge. And also from Western side, to China to understand Western discourse is also a very big challenge. As you said, those translations, in other words, I really don't find good translation in Chinese and also in English. For example, state, nations, country. In China, it's only one word, 国家. But in English, 3 different words have totally different meanings. Ethnic, for example, when I came to the United States in the 1980s, I tried to find the right word, never find it. Eventually, Chinese borrowed from Taiwan, 族群, to translate ethnic. Somehow, it's really strange. That rhetoric, he said, is also very different. 修辞 definitely is not the word for rhetoric. Rhetoric is very different from 修辞 Chinese word. So there are a lot of problems here to understand each other. So I'm so glad you do that research, trying to help, I don't know, Americans or Polish people to understand.
We don't have this kind of big audience in Poland here.
Question, Sam. There's a thing called the Confucius Institute that's bringing a lot of Chinese language to the U.S. at the expense of the country.
Not only U.S.,
What's
everywhere in the world.
the propaganda or the philosophical or the
Propaganda.
impetus for this?
Money.
Okay, yeah, expand on that.
You know, I asked a friend of mine in Beijing, what's up with Confucius Institute? He said, we had a lot of money, we didn't know what to do with it. why we
So we
start
don't
to
have money,
copy,
but,
we start to copy Goethe Institute and so on and so forth.
That can't be the whole reason. Education.
Vater.
No,
They do
different,
speak,
three
but they
different
send-
words from one.
But in Denver now, there are 20 young teachers sent by China through Confucius system. They have signed a contract to be here 2 years. When they got here, I heard quite a few of them, oh, I want to go back to China. Then the government said, okay, we paid for your flight ticket and also your stipend, pay back if you want to go back to China earlier. We give you money to spend in America. Then one of them, I think in the metropolitan state here, the teacher got some kind of a really big problem with the student, got into some legal, he used some kind of very politically incorrect words in this country. Then got into big trouble. Yeah, so there are a lot of different problems. Chinese government spend those money. I don't know, good or bad. Okay, so with that, please join me to thank Dominik. Stanley Rosen, Professor Stanley Rosen from University of Southern California. He is a very good scholar in this country, has been in this business over 40 years. And then next quarter, we have a full schedule, starting with a professor from Duke University, Liu Kang, in Chinese, although his name, because he's the author of 妖魔化中国. That's the author of him. Behind people, when talking about how American people demonize China, 在妖魔化中国的背后, he's the author, one of the authors of that book. And then we have a diplomat from State Department, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, coming to talk about China, African, and U.S. relationship. And then we have a speaker, Dan Wright. He is a former Treasury Department official, and now he's doing, because the Republican government is gone, so he's doing his own private consulting. He will talk about China-U.S. relationship. Then we have our annual conference, as I mentioned. This year is about China's relationships with Asian Pacific neighbors. We have presenters from China, from Hong Kong, from India, from Japan, from Korea, to talk about those issues. And also then we have a former diplomat from Taiwan coming talk about Taiwan, U.S. and China relationship. So please pay attention to emails. Okay, thank you for coming.